15 coffins, 15 years. One woman's tender hands. In the cobblestone streets of Bremen, they called her an angel, until a doctor found white powder in her bread. What if the person you trusted most was slowly killing you with kindness? This is the true story of Gesche Gottfried, the woman who turned love into a weapon. The morning bells of St. Petri Cathedral rang through the mist-shrouded streets of Bremen, as Gesche Margareta Gottfried knelt beside her husband's bed, her pale hands smoothing the woolen blanket across his fevered chest. The year was 1813, and the Napoleonic Wars had left their mark on every German household, but none more so than the modest timber-framed house on Pieperstrasse, where Gesche tended to her ailing spouse with the devotion of a saint. "Mein Lieber," she whispered, her voice carrying the soft lilt of Low German that echoed through Bremen's merchant quarters. "I've prepared your favorite bread with the special butter from Frau Weber's dairy." Johann Miltenberg, her husband of 3 years, managed a weak smile despite the persistent nausea that had plagued him for weeks. His face, once robust from years working the Bremen docks, had grown gaunt and pale, his eyes sunken deep into their sockets. The local physician, Dr. Hoffman, had diagnosed it as a stomach ailment common among the working men who handled foreign goods, perhaps contaminated grain from the French territories. "You are too good to me, Gesche," Johann murmured, accepting the thick slice of dark rye bread spread generously with what appeared to be a yellowish butter. "What would I do without your care?" Gesche's lips curved into a gentle smile, though something flickered behind her gray eyes, something that might have been satisfaction, or perhaps anticipation. She had been mixing the butter herself lately, she told the neighbors, adding special herbs and animal fats that her grandmother had taught her about. The Bremen housewives envied her dedication. In a city where women were expected to be strong and practical, Gesche embodied the ideal of feminine devotion. The room was small but meticulously clean, with heavy wooden furniture that spoke of modest prosperity. Gesche had arranged dried herbs along the windowsill, chamomile, lavender, and several others that the neighbors couldn't identify. The scent was pleasant, almost medicinal, masking any other odors that might have lingered in the sick room. "The herbs help purify the air," she explained to anyone who asked, her voice always soft and measured. "My grandmother knew these things. She said that healing comes through understanding what the body truly needs." As Johann ate the bread, Gesche busied herself with tidying the room, her movements graceful and purposeful. She wore the simple black dress that had become her signature, practical, modest, and always impeccably clean. Her auburn hair was pulled back severely, and she wore no jewelry except for a simple silver cross at her throat. "The pain is getting worse," Johann gasped, clutching his stomach. "It feels like fire in my belly." "Shh," Gesche soothed, returning to his side with a damp cloth. "The medicine takes time to work. You must be patient, mein Lieber. Sometimes we must endure suffering before we can find peace." She dabbed his forehead with the cool cloth, her touch gentle but somehow clinical. Through the small window, the sounds of Bremen's morning commerce drifted in. The clip-clop of horses' hooves on cobblestones, the calls of merchants hawking their wares, the distant lowing of cattle being driven to market. Life continued its rhythm while Johann Miltenberg slowly weakened in his bed. "I've been having strange dreams," Johann whispered, his voice barely audible. "I see my mother. She's calling to me from across a field of white flowers. She says it's time to come home." Gesche's hand stilled on his forehead. "Dreams can be messages, Johann. Perhaps your mother is trying to tell you something important. But I'm not ready to leave you," he protested weakly. "We have so much life ahead of us." "Life is not always about what we want," Gesche replied, her voice taking on an almost philosophical tone. "Sometimes it's about accepting what God has planned for us. Some souls are meant to suffer in this world, and others are meant to find release." That evening, as Johann's breathing grew more labored, Gesche sat beside his bed with a leather-bound journal in her lap. By candlelight, she wrote in careful script, "Day 23 of Johann's illness. The suffering continues, but I see signs of approaching peace. The body rebels against its earthly bonds, seeking the purity that only comes through complete surrender. Tonight, I believe the voice will speak to me again, and I will know when to prepare the final blessing." She paused in her writing, listening to her husband's ragged breathing. Outside, Bremen slept under a blanket of fog rolling in from the Weser River. and somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled the hour. Gesche closed the journal and placed it carefully in a wooden box beneath her bed, alongside several small vials containing white powder. Soon, she whispered to the darkness, soon you will understand what true love means. By dawn, Johann Miltenberg was dead, and Gesche Gottfried had become Bremen's most devoted widow. The funeral was well attended, with the entire neighborhood praising her tireless care and devotion. As the coffin was lowered into the ground at St. Petri's Cemetery, Gesche stood in her black dress, tears streaming down her face, accepting the condolences of her neighbors. Such a devoted wife, the women whispered among themselves. If only all women had such dedication to their husbands. What they didn't know was that Gesche had already begun planning her next act of devotion. Her elderly parents, living alone in their cottage on the outskirts of Bremen, had been complaining of various ailments. They would need her care soon, and Gesche Gottfried was nothing if not a dutiful daughter. In her journal that night she wrote, "The first blessing is complete. Johann has found his peace, and I have found my purpose. The voice grows stronger each day, and I begin to understand the true meaning of love. Tomorrow I will visit my parents. They look so tired, so ready for rest. Perhaps it is time for them to receive their blessings as well." As Bremen slept, Gesche carefully prepared 3 new portions of her special butter, mixing the white powder with animal fat and herbs in precise proportions. She had learned from her grandmother that the most powerful medicine often came in the smallest doses, given with patience and love over time. The Angel of Bremen had begun her work, and 15 years of devotion stretched ahead of her like a long, dark path through the mist. 6 months after Johann's funeral, Gesche Gottfried walked through the narrow streets of Bremen's Altstadt, her black shawl pulled tight against the October chill. The city had recovered from the war's devastation, and merchants once again filled the market squares with goods from across the Hanseatic League. But Gesche's mind was not on commerce or recovery. It was on the small cottage where her parents waited for her weekly visit. Heinrich and Margareta Timm had raised 6 children in that cottage, but age and hardship had taken their toll. Heinrich, now 72, spent most of his days in a wooden chair by the fire, his hands twisted with arthritis from decades of carpentry. Margaret, at 68, could barely manage the simple tasks of cooking and cleaning that had once been second nature. "Gesche, mein Kind," Margareta called from the doorway as her daughter approached. "You look so thin. Are you eating enough?" "I eat well enough, Mutter," Gesche replied, kissing her mother's weathered cheek. "But I worry about you and Vater. You both seem so frail." The cottage was cramped and dark, with a single room serving as kitchen, parlor, and dining area. A narrow ladder led to the loft where Gesche's parents slept on a straw mattress. The air smelled of wood smoke and something else, something stale and sickly that seemed to cling to the walls. Heinrich looked up from his chair, his eyes cloudy with cataracts. "The pain in my joints grows worse each day," he complained. "And my stomach. It churns like a storm at sea." "I've brought something to help," Gesche said, unpacking a small basket. "Fresh bread and the special butter I've been making. It has healing properties. Grandmother taught me the recipe before she died." She spoke of her grandmother often, this mysterious woman who had supposedly passed down ancient knowledge of herbs and healing. The neighbors found it comforting to think that such wisdom lived on, but none of them had ever met this grandmother or could recall Gesche mentioning her before Johann's death. "What makes it special?" Margaret asked, watching as Gesche spread the yellowish butter on thick slices of bread. "It's made with rendered fat from specific animals, mixed with herbs that purify the blood," Gesche explained, her voice taking on the patient tone of a teacher. "Grandmother said it helps the body release its burdens. She called it Mäusbutter, mouse butter, because it's so potent that even a small amount can transform everything." Heinrich accepted the bread gratefully, his gnarled fingers shaking as he brought it to his lips. "It tastes unusual," he said after the first bite. "Slightly bitter. The healing herbs often are," Gesche replied smoothly. "Grandmother said that medicine must sometimes be unpleasant to be effective. The body recognizes what it needs, even when the mind resists." As her parents ate, Gesche busied herself with cleaning the cottage, moving about with the same methodical precision she had shown in her own home. She swept the floors, organized the sparse belongings, and tended to the fire with practiced efficiency. But her eyes kept returning to her parents. watching for signs of the changes she expected to see. "Tell me about this grandmother," Margaret said, setting down her half-eaten bread. "I don't remember you speaking of her recipes before." Gesche paused in her sweeping, her back to her mother. "She came to me in dreams after Johann died," she said quietly. "She showed me things, old knowledge that had been forgotten. She said that some people are chosen to carry special burdens, to help others find peace when they cannot find it themselves." "Dreams can be powerful," Heinrich agreed, though his voice was growing weaker. "Sometimes the dead speak to us when we need guidance most." "Yes," Gesche whispered, turning to face her parents. "Sometimes they do." Over the following weeks, Gesche's visits became more frequent. She would arrive each morning with fresh bread and butter, spending hours caring for her parents as their health mysteriously declined. Heinrich's arthritis seemed to worsen, and he developed a persistent cough that racked his thin frame. Margaret complained of stomach pains and a strange metallic taste in her mouth. "Perhaps we should call Dr. Hoffman," Margaret suggested one morning, her face pale and drawn. "Doctors don't understand the old ways," Gesche replied, helping her mother to bed. "They prescribe treatments that fight against the body's natural wisdom. Trust me, Mutter, I know what's best for you." She sat beside the bed, stroking her mother's gray hair with gentle fingers. "Grandmother told me that suffering is sometimes necessary before healing can begin. The body must be purged of its impurities before it can find true peace." In her journal that night, Gesche wrote, "Week 8 of caring for my parents. The transformation progresses slowly but surely. Mutter grows weaker each day, but I see a strange peace in her eyes, as if she's beginning to understand what lies ahead. Vater's cough brings up blood now, a sign that the body is releasing its deepest toxins. The voice speaks to me more clearly now, telling me exactly how much butter to prepare each day. It says that love sometimes requires difficult choices and that true devotion means helping others find the rest they cannot find alone." The neighbors began to notice the change in the Tim household. Gesche's dedication to her parents was remarkable. She was there every morning, every evening, tending to their needs with the same selfless care she had shown her husband. The women of Bremen held her up as an example of filial duty, though some whispered that she seemed almost too devoted, too eager to shoulder such a burden. "She's becoming quite thin herself," Frau Weber observed to her husband one evening. "All that worry and care, it's taking its toll on the poor girl." "Such devotion is rare," Herr Weber replied. "Her parents are fortunate to have such a daughter." But not everyone was convinced. Dr. Hoffman, the physician who had treated Johann Miltenberg, began to notice a pattern in the deaths and illnesses he was called to treat. The symptoms were similar: stomach ailments, weakness, strange tastes in the mouth, and they all seemed to cluster around certain families, certain households. One evening, as he sat in his study reviewing his patient notes, a disturbing thought occurred to him. He pulled out the records from Johann Miltenberg's death, then compared them to the reports he had received about Heinrich and Margareta Tim's declining health. The similarities were striking, but what troubled him most was the common thread: Gesche Gottfried's devoted care. "It's probably nothing," he told himself, but the doubt lingered. In his medical training in Hamburg, he had learned about various poisons and their effects. The symptoms he was seeing were consistent with arsenic poisoning, but surely no one would be evil enough to use such knowledge against their own family. Still, he made a note to pay closer attention to the households where Gesche Gottfried served as caregiver. If his suspicions were correct, then Bremen's angel of mercy might be something far more sinister. Meanwhile, in the cottage on the outskirts of the city, Heinrich and Margareta Tim lay dying slowly, their bodies ravaged by the medicine their loving daughter fed them each day. And in her black dress, with her gentle hands and soft voice, Gesche Gottfried continued her work of devotion, preparing the next batch of Mäusebutter with the same care and precision she had learned from her imaginary grandmother. The voice in her head was growing stronger, and it whispered that her parents' suffering was almost over. Soon she would be free to extend her special brand of love to others who needed her care. After all, Bremen was full of people who were tired, sick, and ready for the peace that only death could bring. Dr. Friedrich Hoffmann set down his coffee cup with shaking hands as he read the death certificate he had just completed. Heinrich Tim, age 72, cause of death: stomach ailment and respiratory failure. It was the third such death in 6 months, and all three had been under the devoted care of Gesche Gottfried. The morning light filtered through the windows of his clinic on Böttcherstrasse, illuminating the medical texts that lined his shelves. He had studied medicine at the University of Göttingen, where his professors had impressed upon him the importance of observation and critical thinking. Now those skills were telling him something that his heart didn't want to believe. He pulled out a leather folder containing his patient records and spread them across his desk. Johann Miltenberg, dead in 1813. Heinrich Timm, dead just yesterday. And according to the reports from neighbors, Margareta Timm was declining rapidly under her daughter's care. The symptoms are identical, he muttered to himself, comparing the notes. Stomach pain, nausea, weakness, metallic taste, hair loss. He paused, his finger tracing the line of symptoms, and all of them cared for by the same woman. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. "Herr Doctor," came a woman's voice. "I've brought my mother to see you." Dr. Hoffman looked up to see Gesche Gottfried standing in his doorway, supporting an elderly woman who appeared to be on the verge of collapse. Margareta Timm's face was gray and drawn, her eyes sunken deep in their sockets. "Mutter has been feeling poorly," Gesche explained, her voice carrying the same gentle concern that had made her famous throughout Bremen. "She can barely keep food down, and she's been having terrible pains in her stomach." Dr. Hoffman studied the two women carefully. Gesche looked tired but healthy, her black dress impeccable as always. Margaret, however, looked like she was dying, and the similarity to her husband's condition was unmistakable. "Please have her sit here," he said, gesturing to the examination chair. As he began his examination, he noticed that Margaret's fingernails had dark lines running across them, a sign he had read about in his medical texts but never seen in person. "Has she been eating regularly?" he asked. "Oh yes," Gesche replied quickly. "I bring her fresh bread and butter every day. She has such a poor appetite, but I make sure she eats enough to keep her strength up. And this bread and butter, where do you get it?" "I make the butter myself," Gesche said, and Dr. Hoffman caught something in her voice. A note of pride, perhaps, or possessiveness. "It's a special recipe my grandmother taught me. It helps with digestion and purifies the blood." Dr. Hoffman's hand stilled on Margareta's wrist as he took her pulse. The woman's heartbeat was irregular and weak, but it was Gesche's words that sent a chill down his spine. In his medical training, he had learned about the historical use of various substances as medicines, including arsenic, which was sometimes called inheritance powder by those who used it for darker purposes. "This butter," he said carefully, "what exactly goes into it?" "Oh, various herbs and animal fats," Gesche replied with a smile. Grandmother was very particular about the ingredients. She said that healing often requires ingredients that might seem strange to those who don't understand the old ways. As Dr. Hoffman continued his examination, he noticed that Margaret's hair was falling out in patches, and her skin had a peculiar grayish tint. When he pressed on her abdomen, she cried out in pain. Her liver was enlarged and tender. "Frau Gottfried," he said, turning to Gesche, "I wonder if you might bring me a sample of this special butter you've been preparing. I'd like to examine it more closely." For just a moment, Gesche's composed expression flickered, and Dr. Hoffman saw something behind her eyes that made his blood run cold. Then the mask slipped back into place, and she was once again the devoted daughter. "Of course, Herr Doctor," she said smoothly, "though I'm not sure what you hope to find. It's just simple ingredients, prepared with love and care." "I'm sure it is, Doctor," Hoffman replied, but his mind was already racing ahead to the tests he would need to perform. He had access to the Marsh test, a new method for detecting arsenic that had been developed just a few years earlier. If his suspicions were correct, Gesche's butter would reveal its deadly secret. After the women left, Dr. Hoffman sat alone in his clinic, staring at the door through which they had departed. He had sworn an oath to do no harm, but what was his responsibility when he suspected that harm was being done by someone else? Someone who appeared to be the very embodiment of selfless care. That evening, he visited his colleague, Dr. Wilhelm Müller, who served as the city's coroner. They met in Müller's office beneath the city hall, where the smell of formaldehyde and other chemicals hung heavy in the air. "Wilhelm, Doctor," Hoffman began carefully, I need to ask you about the recent deaths in the Tim family. Have you noticed anything unusual? Dr. Miller looked up from the papers he was reviewing. Unusual how? The symptoms, the progression of the illness. Have you seen anything similar in your other cases? Now that you mention it, Dr. Miller said slowly, there have been several deaths in the past few years with remarkably similar presentations. All appeared to be stomach ailments, all involved prolonged periods of care by family members. He paused, his eyes meeting Dr. Hoffman's. Are you thinking what I think you're thinking? I'm not sure what I'm thinking, Dr. Hoffman admitted, but I've agreed to test a sample of some special butter that Gesche Gottfried has been preparing for her family members. If it contains what I suspect it might contain, arsenic, Dr. Miller finished. God help us all. The two men sat in silence for a moment, contemplating the implications of what they were discussing. Bremen was a small city where everyone knew everyone else's business. If Gesche Gottfried was indeed poisoning her family members, the scandal would rock the community to its foundations. We need to be absolutely certain before we make any accusations, Dr. Miller said finally. The woman is beloved throughout the city. If we're wrong, and if we're right? Dr. Hoffman asked. How many more people will die while we debate the proper course of action? The next morning, Gesche arrived at Dr. Hoffman's clinic with a small jar of her special butter. She handed it to him with a smile, but he noticed that her hands were trembling slightly. I do hope this helps you understand what's been making Mutter so ill, she said. Perhaps there's something in the recipe that doesn't agree with her constitution. Perhaps, Dr. Hoffman agreed, accepting the jar. I'll examine it carefully and let you know what I find. As soon as Gesche left, Dr. Hoffman began his analysis. He carefully scraped a small amount of the butter onto a clean slide and prepared it for testing. The Marsh test was complex and required precise measurements, but he had performed it before in his studies. Hours later, as the chemical reaction proceeded, Dr. Hoffman watched with growing horror as the telltale signs of arsenic became unmistakable. The butter contained enough poison to kill a horse, administered in small doses over time to create the appearance of natural illness. Dear God, he whispered, staring at the evidence before him. She's been murdering her own family. But even as the reality of Gesche's crimes became clear, Dr. Hoffman faced a terrible dilemma. How could he prove that the Angel of Bremen, the woman who had been held up as a paragon of devotion and care, was actually a cold-blooded killer? And how many more people would die while he gathered the evidence needed to stop her? In her cottage that night, Gesche Gottfried sat beside her mother's bed, watching as Margaret's breathing grew more labored. The old woman was close to death now, just as her husband had been, just as Johann had been. Soon, Gesche would be free to extend her special care to others who needed it. She opened her journal and wrote, "The doctor suspects something, but he doesn't understand. He sees death as failure, but I see it as mercy. Mutter will be at peace soon, and then I will be free to help others find their rest. The voice grows stronger each day, and it tells me that my work is just beginning. There are so many people in Bremen who are tired, so many who suffer without hope. They need someone who understands what true love means." Outside, the night wind whispered through the streets of Bremen, carrying with it the scent of the sea and the promise of storms to come. And in the darkness, a killer sat vigil beside her dying mother, planning her next act of devotion. The bells of St. Martini Church were tolling for Margareta Tim's funeral when Dr. Hoffman made his fateful decision. Standing at the edge of the cemetery, watching as Bremen's citizens paid their respects to the latest victim of what they believed was natural death, he knew he could no longer remain silent. Gesche Gottfried stood beside the grave in her eternal black dress, tears streaming down her face as she accepted condolences from the gathered mourners. She played the part of the grieving daughter perfectly, her shoulders shaking with what appeared to be genuine sorrow. "Such a devoted daughter," whispered Frau Weber to her neighbor. "First her husband, then her father, now her mother. The poor girl has suffered so much loss." "God tests those he loves most," came the reply. "She's been blessed with a caring heart, but such blessings often come with great pain." Dr. Hoffman listened to these conversations with growing dread. If his suspicions were correct, then these well-meaning citizens were praising a woman who had systematically murdered her own family. The thought made his stomach turn. After the funeral, he made his way to the office of Oberrichter Klaus Weber, Bremen's chief magistrate. The man was known for his careful deliberation and strict adherence to the law, qualities that Dr. Hoffman hoped would serve him well in the delicate matter he was about to present. "Dr. Hoffman," Weber greeted him from behind his massive oak desk. "What brings you to see me on such a somber day?" "I'm afraid it's a matter of the utmost gravity," Dr. Hoffman replied, settling into the chair across from the magistrate. "I have reason to believe that the recent deaths in the Tim family were not natural." Weber's eyebrows rose. "Are you suggesting foul play?" "I'm suggesting murder," Dr. Hoffman said bluntly. "And I believe I know who the killer is." For the next hour, Dr. Hoffman laid out his case. He presented his medical records, showing the pattern of symptoms that had appeared in each victim. He described his analysis of Geshe's special butter and the undeniable presence of arsenic. He detailed the timeline of deaths and the common thread that connected them all. Weber listened in silence, his expression growing more grave with each revelation. When Dr. Hoffman finished, the magistrate sat back in his chair and stared at the papers spread across his desk. "This is extraordinary," Weber said finally. "You're asking me to believe that Geshe Gottfried, a woman who has been held up as a model of Christian virtue, is actually a serial killer." "I'm asking you to consider the evidence," Dr. Hoffman replied. "The arsenic doesn't lie, Herr Weber. Someone has been poisoning these people, and Geshe Gottfried is the only person who had both the means and the opportunity." "But what about motive?" Weber asked. "Why would a woman kill her own family?" Dr. Hoffman shook his head. "I don't pretend to understand the mind of such a person. Perhaps she enjoys the attention, the sympathy of the community. Perhaps she's simply mad. But the why is less important than the what. And what she's done is murder." Weber stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the busy street below. Bremen was a city built on trade and trust, where a person's reputation was their most valuable asset. To accuse someone of Geshe's standing would require absolute certainty. "If we're wrong," Weber said quietly, "we'll destroy an innocent woman's life. If we're right," he paused, the implications hanging in the air. "How many people do you think she's killed?" "I can only speak to the cases I've personally observed," Dr. Hoffman replied. "But if she's been doing this for years, as I suspect, then the number could be much higher." Weber turned back to his desk and picked up one of the medical reports. "What do you recommend?" "We need to investigate her other victims," Dr. Hoffman said. "Anyone who has died under her care should be examined. We may need to order exhumations to test for arsenic in the remains. And in the meantime, we watch her carefully. If she's the killer I believe her to be, she won't stop. She'll find another victim, someone else who needs her care." Weber's prediction proved accurate sooner than either man expected. Within a week of Margareta Tim's funeral, word spread through Bremen that Geshe Gottfried had taken in a sick child, little Anna Rumpf, the 7-year-old daughter of a widow who worked in the textile mills. "The poor child has been suffering from stomach problems," Geshe explained to anyone who would listen. "Her mother works such long hours that she can barely care for herself, let alone a sick child. I couldn't stand to see little Anna suffer, Doctor." Hoffman felt his blood run cold when he heard the news. He immediately sought out Anna's mother, Bertha Rumpf, at the textile mill where she worked. "Frau Rumpf," he said, approaching her during her brief lunch break. "I need to speak with you about your daughter." Bertha looked up from her meager meal, her face drawn with worry and exhaustion. "Has something happened to Anna? Frau Gottfried said she was getting the best care possible. That's what I'm concerned about, Doctor." Hoffman said carefully, "I'd like to examine Anna myself if you don't mind. I have some experience with childhood stomach ailments." "But Frau Gottfried said doctors don't understand children the way women do," Bertha protested. "She's been so kind to take Anna in, and she has such a gentle way with her." Dr. Hoffman chose his words carefully. "I'm sure Frau Gottfried means well, but I'd feel better if I could examine Anna myself. It won't cost you anything, and it might help us understand what's making her sick." Bertha's worry overcame her reluctance. "If you think it might help." That evening, Dr. Hoffman arrived at Geshe's house on Pieperstrasse, his medical bag in hand. Geshe met him at the door, her expression cool but polite. "Dr. Hoffman," she said, "I wasn't expecting you. Frau Rumpf asked me to examine little Anna," he replied. "She's concerned about the child's condition." "I see." Geshe's voice was carefully neutral. "Well, Anna is resting upstairs. She had a difficult day, but I've been giving her my special butter to help with her stomach problems. Dr. Hoffman's heart sank. If Gesche was already feeding the child her poisoned butter, they might already be too late. "May I see her?" he asked. Gesche hesitated for a moment, and Dr. Hoffman saw calculation in her eyes. Then she smiled and stepped aside. "Of course. I'm sure she'll be happy to see a new face." Anna Rumpf lay in a small bed in Gesche's spare room, her face pale and drawn. She looked up at Dr. Hoffman with large, frightened eyes. "Hello, Anna," he said gently, sitting beside the bed. "I'm Dr. Hoffman. Your mother asked me to come see how you're feeling." "My tummy hurts," Anna whispered, "and I feel sick all the time." Dr. Hoffman began his examination, noting the same symptoms he had seen in Gesche's other victims. The child's pulse was weak, her abdomen tender, and she complained of a metallic taste in her mouth. "What has she been eating?" he asked Gesche. "Just simple foods," Gesche replied. "Bread and butter, some soup, a little milk, nothing that should upset her stomach. And this butter. It's the same special recipe you made for your parents?" "Yes," Gesche said, and Dr. Hoffman caught a note of defiance in her voice. "It's very nutritious. My grandmother swore by it, doctor." Hoffman finished his examination and stood up. "I'd like to try a different treatment for Anna," he said, "something that might be more suitable for a child her age." "What kind of treatment?" Gesche asked sharply. "A special diet? No butter or rich foods for a few days. Just clear broth and bread. It will help her stomach settle." Gesche's eyes narrowed. "I don't think that's wise. Anna needs proper nutrition to recover her strength. Sometimes the stomach needs rest more than food, doctor." Hoffman replied firmly. "I'll speak with her mother about it." As he left Gesche's house, Dr. Hoffman felt the weight of his terrible knowledge. Another innocent life hung in the balance, and he was the only one who could save her. But he also knew that by interfering, he was alerting Gesche to his suspicions. The deadly game between them had entered a new phase. That night, Gesche sat in her parlor with her journal, writing by candlelight. "The doctor came today. He suspects something, but he doesn't understand the true nature of mercy. Little Anna is suffering, and her mother is too poor and tired to care for her properly. The child needs peace, not more suffering. But the doctor wants to interfere, to prolong her agony with his treatments. He doesn't hear the voice that speaks to me, doesn't understand that some souls are meant to be released from this world. I must be more careful now, more patient. The work must continue, but it must be done in secret." She closed the journal and looked up at the ceiling, where little Anna lay sleeping in the room above. Tomorrow, she would have to find a way to continue the child's treatment without arousing further suspicion. The voice was growing more insistent, telling her that Anna's time was near, but she would have to be clever about how she administered the final doses. Outside, Bremen slept under a blanket of fog, unaware that a battle for a child's life was being fought in the shadows, and in his own study, Dr. Hoffman sat writing urgent letters to the magistrate, begging for swift action before another innocent soul was lost to the angel of Bremen's twisted version of mercy. The morning mist hung thick over Bremen as Dr. Hoffman rushed through the cobblestone streets toward Gesche Gottfried's house. 3 days had passed since his examination of little Anna Rumpf, and his worst fears were materializing. Despite his attempts to intervene, the child's condition was deteriorating rapidly. He had spent the previous evening with Oberrichter Weber, finalizing plans for Gesche's arrest. The evidence was overwhelming. The arsenic in the butter, the pattern of deaths, the medical records that painted a clear picture of systematic poisoning. But Weber had insisted on waiting until they could gather more evidence, concerned about the public reaction to arresting Bremen's most beloved citizen. "We need to be absolutely certain," Weber had said. "The people of this city won't accept accusations against Gesche Gottfried lightly." Now, as Dr. Hoffman approached the house on Pieperstrasse, he wondered if their caution had cost Anna Rumpf her life. The sound of weeping from within the house confirmed his worst fears. Bertha Rumpf sat beside her daughter's bed, clutching the child's lifeless hand. Anna's small face was peaceful in death, but her mother's anguish filled the room like a physical presence. "She died in her sleep," Gesche said softly, standing in the doorway with her hands folded. "There was no pain, no struggle. She simply let go." Dr. Hoffman knelt beside the bed, his trained eye taking in the telltale signs of arsenic poisoning. The child's fingernails showed the characteristic dark lines, and her skin had the grayish pallor he had learned to recognize. "When did she last eat?" he asked. "I gave her some bread and butter just before bedtime," Gesche replied. She said it made her feel better. Dr. Hoffman's jaw tightened. Even knowing that he suspected her, Gesche had continued poisoning the child. The brazenness of it was staggering. "I'll need to examine the body more thoroughly," he said, standing. "And I'll need samples of any food she consumed in the past few days." "Is that really necessary?" Gesche asked. "The poor child has suffered enough. Can't we let her rest in peace?" "Justice requires understanding," Dr. Hoffman replied firmly. "Anna deserves that much." As he left the house, Dr. Hoffman felt a cold certainty settle over him. Gesche Gottfried had killed again, and this time her victim was an innocent child. The time for caution and legal niceties had passed. He went directly to Weber's office, where he found the magistrate preparing for the day's court sessions. "She's killed the child," Dr. Hoffman announced without preamble. "Anna Rumpf died last night, and I have no doubt that Gesche Gottfried poisoned her." Weber's face went pale. "Are you certain?" "As certain as I can be without a complete autopsy," Dr. Hoffman replied. "The symptoms are unmistakable." "How many more people have to die before we act?" Weber stood and walked to his window, gazing out at the city he had sworn to protect. "Very well," he said finally. "We'll arrest her today, but we'll need to be prepared for the public reaction." "Let me handle the medical evidence," Dr. Hoffman said. "I'll perform a full examination of Anna's body and test samples from Gesche's house. By the time we bring her before a judge, there will be no doubt about her guilt." That afternoon, as Anna Rumpf's body was being prepared for burial, constables arrived at Gesche's house with a warrant for her arrest. The neighbors gathered in the street, watching in shock as the woman they had revered as a saint was led away in shackles. "There must be some mistake," Frau Weber said, her voice trembling. "Gesche would never hurt anyone." "She's devoted her life to caring for others," another woman added. "This is impossible." But as word spread through Bremen of the charges against Gesche Gottfried, a different picture began to emerge. Dr. Hoffman's investigation had uncovered a trail of death that stretched back 15 years, encompassing not just her immediate family, but other victims as well. There was her second husband, Michael Gottfried, who had died after a brief illness in 1815. There was her friend Wilhelm Rumke, who had succumbed to stomach problems after staying in her house for several weeks. There was her young son, Johann, who had died of mysterious ailments at the age of 3. The pattern was always the same: devoted care, special foods prepared with love, and a peaceful death that left no suspicion in its wake. Gesche had been the angel of death, disguised as an angel of mercy. In her cell beneath the city hall, Gesche sat in darkness, her journal confiscated as evidence. For the first time in years, she was alone with her thoughts, without the voice that had guided her actions for so long. She thought about Johann, her first husband, and how easy it had been to convince everyone that his death was natural. She remembered the satisfaction she had felt as she watched him slip away, knowing that she had given him the gift of peace. The power had been intoxicating, the ability to decide who lived and who died, to play God in the lives of those around her. But it hadn't been about power, not really. It had been about love. She had loved them all in her own way, and she had wanted to spare them the pain of living in a world that was cruel and harsh. Death was a mercy, and she had been its instrument. The voice had started after Johann's death, whispering to her about the others who needed her help. Her parents, suffering with age and illness. Little Anna, trapped in poverty and sickness. They had all been better off dead, and she had been brave enough to do what others couldn't. Now, as she sat in her cell, Gesche wondered if the voice would come to her again. Would it tell her how to escape this situation? How to continue her work? Or had it abandoned her, now that her mission was complete? The trial of Gesche Gottfried began 3 weeks later, and it became the most sensational legal proceeding in Bremen's history. Dr. Hoffman testified about the arsenic he had found in her butter, presenting chemical evidence that was revolutionary for its time. Witnesses described the pattern of deaths that had followed in Gesche's wake, painting a picture of a woman who had systematically murdered her own family. But perhaps the most damning evidence came from Gesche's own journal. which revealed the twisted logic behind her crimes. The court listened in horror as passages were read aloud, describing her victims' suffering and her belief that death was a mercy she was uniquely qualified to provide. She writes of a voice that guided her actions, the prosecutor noted. A voice that told her when to administer the poison and how much to give. Whether this voice was real or a product of her diseased mind, the result was the same. 15 people died by her hand. Gesch's defense attorney argued that she was insane, that no rational person could commit such acts. But the careful planning evident in her crimes, the methodical way she had avoided suspicion for so long, suggested a mind that was calculating rather than mad. On the final day of the trial, Gesche was allowed to address the court. She stood in the dock, still wearing her black dress, and spoke in the same soft voice that had once comforted her victims. "I do not ask for forgiveness," she said. "I do not expect understanding. I only ask that you remember that everything I did was done out of love. I love my husband, my parents, my children, and all the others who came under my care. I love them enough to spare them the pain of living in a world that offers nothing but suffering." She paused, her gray eyes scanning the packed courtroom. "You call me a killer, but I was a healer. You call me evil, but I was merciful. The voice that spoke to me was not the voice of madness, it was the voice of truth, telling me what needed to be done." The verdict was inevitable. Gesche Gottfried was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death. She would be executed by sword, in the traditional manner, in the public square before the gathered citizens of Bremen. On the morning of her execution, Gesche walked to the scaffold with the same composure she had shown throughout her trial. She refused the blindfold and faced the crowd that had gathered to witness her death. "I go to my rest knowing that I have done what was asked of me," she said. "The voice is with me still, and it tells me that my work is complete. Those I helped find peace wait for me on the other side, and they will welcome me as their angel." The executioner's sword fell, and Gesche Gottfried's reign of terror came to an end. But her story lived on in the whispered legends of Bremen, where people still spoke of the angel of death who had walked among them, dispensing mercy with poison and love with murder. In the years that followed, the house on Pieperstrasse stood empty, its windows boarded up and its rooms left to decay. Children dared each other to approach the building on dark nights, claiming they could see a figure in black moving through the rooms, still preparing her deadly butter for victims who would never come. Dr. Hoffmann continued his practice, but he was forever changed by his encounter with Gesche Gottfried. He had learned that evil could wear the face of kindness, that murder could masquerade as mercy. The lesson haunted him for the rest of his life. And in the cemetery of St. Petri, where 15 of Gesche's victims lay buried, flowers still appeared on their graves from time to time, offerings from an unknown hand that some claimed belonged to the ghost of the Angel of Bremen, still tending to her flock in death, as she had in life. The voice that had guided her actions was silent now, but its whispers seemed to echo through the fog-shrouded streets of Bremen, reminding all who heard them that love and death were sometimes separated by nothing more than the thickness of butter on bread and the twisted mercy of a woman who believed that killing was the kindest thing she could do.